And when you work with someone, you don't want to hurt them, but sometimes you do.
This is somebody who's watching.
Most likely. What can I say? I made a mistake. At the time, it seemed like a very small mistake, one that anyone could make. I thought I could live with it. I knew it had to be fixed, but that meant having to do something hurtful, something bad.
It's a very disturbing idea.
There was no other way out. Sometimes it's much easier to pretend you're not in the wrong.
Why do something that may wind up giving you away?
I did try to let it go. I really thought I'd just get used to it, but it stayed with me. It haunted me every day. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I ended up in a bad place. Joey the Geek's got a reputation to uphold. Deep down, I knew how this was going to end.
Oh my, that's very dark.
I had no choice. I had to go through with it, and that's when everything changed. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot, where we give model railroaders the knowledge, tools, and services they need to build a realistic layout and the motivation to work on it right now. I'm thrilled to have you join me for the third installment of this multi-part series on building the Eastern Avenue corner on my Monument City Terminal Division layout. It includes this massive, awe-inspiring structure built using modular parts, scratch building methods, kit bashing, and more. Now in this episode, we're going to talk about using 3D printing to create something new and unique. And we'll also discuss Joey the Geek's tiny little mistake that set off some soul-searching and a guilty conscience, but ultimately culminated in a much more satisfactory outcome. So if you're as curious as I am to see how this iterative process turns out and witness the steps involved in bringing this monumental structure to life, then don't go anywhere. Let's jump right into part 3. During this phase of building my huge Crown Cork Seal building, which is based on the prototype structure in the heart of Baltimore, I encountered a hiccup that left me scratching my head. See, the first 3D print, I didn't want to insult... Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. In the previous episodes of this series, we have explored the process of constructing this model from the ground up, so to speak. If you recall, I broke the construction for the structure itself into 3 parts. Part 1 covered the large curtain wall built from modular pieces. Part 2 tackled the combination scratch build and kit bash of a multi-elevation structure. And Part 3 is the tower, which we'll be discussing in this episode. Later installments will cover the overpasses and scenery. Now, if you haven't watched those first 2 installments yet, I'd suggest you give them a view so that what we talk about here in this video makes some sense. Now, you may remember that before finally ramping up on the construction of this project a little while ago, I'd been procrastinating on it for quite some time. And this tower section was one of the things that actually kept me from making progress on this structure for so long. I'd been unable to find any commercially available kit that was close enough to satisfy me, and the thought of scratch building it with its unusual shapes, concrete detail, and all that brick, well, it wasn't really that appealing to me. Now, when I talked about this in the Projects I Need to Finish in 2023 video, this was on the list, and I did mention the problem I was having with the tower at that point. And this is when my Mastermind group came to the rescue. Now, a Mastermind group is not just a place to set goals and get new ideas, although that is a big part of it. It's also a great networking opportunity. One of the members of my inaugural group, Chuck Coggins, is a retired designer who has taken up 3D printing. Now, in the short time that 3D printing's been around, it's already had a huge positive impact on the hobby. It's a great way to get things that may not be produced on a mass scale, like custom structures or figures. Now, speaking of 3D printed figures, there are still a few days left to take advantage of the Pixel Depot offer from Miniprints. From now until May 31st, 2023, if you order from miniprints.com and use the coupon code TPD15 at checkout, you'll not only get 15% off your order, but if you spend over $20 US, you'll also get a free Joe Parker to add to your layout, or for any other purpose, including voodoo, target practice, anger management exercises, or whatever else you might like. I'll include these links in the description as well. But back to the tower. Chuck offered to design and print one for me, which would save me the trouble of scratch building and or kit bashing. I accepted his offer, and I set about getting him what he needed to get started, including dimensions and prototype photos. After measuring it all out, I determined that I needed a tower that was 5.5 inches on the right, 5.5 inches across the front, and would also have a short wall section on the left that would butt up against the curtain wall, and that needed to be 1/2 inch. I specified a height of 10.25 inches, which I initially thought would be the height from ground level to the top of the tower. At that point, I was assuming I'd need to figure out a way to cut a gap of about 4.5 inches by 3 inches into the finished tower so that the trains would be able to run through. After a little while, he came back to me with some renderings that looked really good. I particularly liked the concrete detail that was going to be included at the top of the tower. Based on the drawings, I assumed Chuck had shortened it so that it would sit on top of the roof, but it did turn out to be the 10.5 inches high that I had specified. Maybe this should have been my first clue that I wasn't picturing things correctly, but more on that in a minute. It was at this point that I decided that I would have to raise the tower structure up using some other method to be able to get it to clear the trains. In other words, I wasn't going to cut a hole into it. I asked Chuck to make some minor modifications, and when it was all said and done, the final height of the print turned out to be closer to 11 5/8 inches than the original 10.5 inches. He showed me the final drawings, and based on those, I gave him the go-ahead to begin the printing process. And this was my first mistake. Not because he'd done a bad job or had done anything wrong, but because I never asked to see the mock-up with any other reference points to help me understand the scale in my head. As an aside, one thing I also didn't realize was how long the printing process would take, as in days. So I settled in and waited, anticipation building with every passing day. When the package finally arrived, I opened it with excitement, which quickly turned to disappointment when I saw just how large the concrete and brick detail was on the model. See, the first 3D print, while well crafted, turned out to be way out of scale for what I was picturing. It was exactly what I'd ordered, except the size of everything was more appropriate for O scale than the HO scale that I model in. Now, full disclosure, the mistake was all on me because I hadn't considered the measurements well enough or asked any questions before signing off. This was absolutely my own fault, and I surely didn't want to insult Chuck. After all, his work was commendable. Now, usually I'm pretty good at visualizing spatial relations, but not this time for some reason. He'd even sent me photos of the finished print, and it still didn't click in my head. But I knew how much work he'd put into it, and I don't like to throw away something that I paid for, so I decided to make the best of it and push forward. I figured I could salvage the situation and still create something worthwhile. Putting my misgivings aside, I painted the tower starting with the same combination of Rust-Oleum Camouflage Khaki as a base, followed by an overspray of Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch Ultra Matte Perfect Gray, like I'd done on the previous section. This got me close to the concrete color that I was seeing in photographs of the prototype. Now I sprayed the entire structure, deciding that it would be a lot easier to hand paint the brick rather than the concrete sections. So to that end, I brushed on Polyscale Denver and Rio Grande Western Freight Car Red, which is a close match to the Krylon ColorMax Red Oxide Primer that I'd used for the rest of the structure. I'm not the neatest hand painter, so touch-ups to the concrete were done afterwards using Polyscale Undercoat Light Gray. Any minor color differences would get covered up by the washes I was going to add later. Now, while we watch this incredibly engrossing footage of the painting process, I'd like to take a minute to shout out and thank my patrons, including my newest members, Paul Lydiard and Craig McSkimming. I'd also ask you to consider becoming a patron of the channel on Patreon. For as little as $2 a month, patrons get access to additional videos, behind-the-scenes footage, downloads, discounts for merchandise on my Spring store, and other goodies including stickers, shirts, and more. The support of my patrons helps me to continue to improve and to allow me to have access to the materials, tools, and supplies that I need to keep providing top-notch videos like these. I hope you'll support me and add your name to this list too. Links are in the description below. With the paint dry, I then proceeded to add the same mortar wash to the brick that I'd used on the other structure sections, and followed that up with a number of coats of Black India ink wash to tone down the colors and provide the impression of dirt and grime on the building, like you'd expect to see from an old building in the middle of a large urban environment. The tower arrived in 2 sections, which was necessary for the printing process, so after painting, I set about assembling them. Although the 2 pieces fit together very snugly, I didn't want to rely only on the top and bottom edges of the printed parts for adhesion. So I added some of the off-brand Lego blocks I bought at the dollar store for this project, as well as some styrene strip to provide extra gluing surface area. I used some clamps to make sure everything was straight and tight as the CA set. Now, as I mentioned, even at 11 5/8 inches, I knew that I was going to need to elevate the tower in some way to get it to the appropriate height over the tracks. If you'll recall, there are 2 staging tracks that run underneath and behind the building, so I needed to find some way to raise the tower structure so that trains would be able to run underneath unimpeded. So once again, I went back to my trusty imitation building blocks and built up 3 legs that would raise the bottom of the tower roughly 3¼ inches above track level. This was plenty of space to get a train underneath, knowing that I would wouldn't be running any high cubes or other extremely tall rolling stock onto that track. I used solvent cement to attach the individual blocks together in the hopes it would solidify the legs as well. To get a flat surface for gluing the legs to the 3D printed tower structure, I snipped off the locking nubs from the top block of each leg. Before gluing the legs on, I tested the location of the tower on the layout so that I could be certain that the legs had solid ground to sit on. I then glued the legs into place. I also glued a 2x2 block into the corner of the tower, flush with the bottom, to give me something to glue that leg to. This allowed me to use solvent cement to attach the Lego blocks to each other, in addition to the CA that would attach the legs to the 3D printed structure. To get the short wall on the left side to be the same size as the new leg, I needed to glue some styrene strip to the tower to get the correct spacing. Since this wouldn't be seen from normal viewing angles, I wasn't exact with the thickness of the styrene, and I didn't paint it either. I then placed the tower into position next to the large curtain wall and behind the kit bash section of the structure that I built in part 2. With that, I thought I was finished. I even posted photos here on YouTube as well as to my Facebook page and Facebook group, touting that the tower section was finished, and for that matter, that the building in general was completed except for the roof. I still wasn't completely happy though. The fact that the structure was, to my eye at least, so out of scale still ate at me. You might ask, why did it matter so much? Some, maybe most people wouldn't care or even notice. But from an early age, I've had an eye for scale. Even as a kid, when I played with Matchbox cars and Lego together, the differences in size bothered me. Today, when I see people using Matchbox and Hot Wheels cars that are 1/64th scale on a 1/87th HO scale layout, it's enough to give me an eye twitch. Now, if it works for them, great. But I notice the discrepancy. And yet, even with all this, I hoped that I could let this go. And then it happened. Someone commented they too thought it was out of scale and more appropriate for O scale. I started to think I might have to bite the bullet and make a change. But how would I tell Chuck? Now, luckily it wasn't too long after that I got an email from him. He had seen the comments and immediately offered a redesign. He didn't seem angry or even bothered. My gut was telling me to make the change, but even then I told him I'd live with it for a while before making a decision. Now, I have high standards, but when somebody does work on my behalf, I don't want to criticize them if the work is good. And that was the case here, especially since the mistake was all mine. I still didn't want to offend Chuck, and I didn't want to be wasteful. But was I ever going to be able to live with this first tower? Luckily, Chuck essentially ignored my comment about living with it and asked what changes I wanted to make. At that point, the load was lifted from my shoulders, and it finally felt okay to move on. Chuck's willingness to work with me and graciousness in accepting my changes were very much appreciated. Realizing I'd never given him any wide-angle views, I sent him some more photos of the prototype building. We agreed to take the original 3D drawing and reduce it 50%, essentially taking it from something more akin to O scale down to something much closer to HO. This would then become the upper corner of the revised tower. He would then fill the rest of the tower with appropriately sized brick. I also asked him to extend the short left wall out to match the width of the 2x2 Lego block. Chuck also decided to continue the concrete detail down to the bottom of the tower, and his final change was to add a jog in the front wall. Both of those last two would help the tower more closely match the prototype. I signed off, and after a mere 5 days and 4 hours of printing, the updated tower was on its way. It was a great collaboration, and this is another hallmark of the Mastermind group. My core group has already collaborated in numerous ways that have helped not only me with this project, but other members of the group in various ways, including interesting solutions to their challenges, as well as access to products and solutions that they may never have known even existed otherwise. At the time of this filming, there is one opening remaining in our inaugural group, and I'm also considering starting a second group that would meet on a different date and week during the month. So if you're interested in either opportunity, please contact me. Also, don't forget, in addition to the Mastermind groups, I also offer lots of other services like layout consultations, track planning, custom backdrop photo creation, and more. To get more information, drop me a line at jparker@thepixeldepot.com. A few days later, I had a brand new 3D print in hand that I knew would bring me closer to the goal of accurately replicating this imposing structure. When the new version arrived, it was once again in 2 pieces, so I used essentially the same process as before, using building blocks, but no styrene this time, for bracing and as a foundation for the CA that was needed to attach the sections together. This time it did require using some 5/1000 shims of styrene to fill a couple of gaps between the top and bottom sections, but I don't feel that this particularly was noticeable in the final product. I once again set about painting the structure using the same color combination for the concrete as I did before. But I also had a problem. I'd used up the bottle of Polyscale Denver and Rio Grande Western Red that I'd used painting the first version of the tower, as it really didn't have much in it to begin with. I didn't think I had any more, and since Polyscale is now out of production, I went about trying to find a close match using craft paint that I had on hand. I did this by spraying a piece of foam core with the spray primer that I'd used on the main building, and then created some swatches of the craft paint that I had on hand. The reds didn't match as well as I'd hoped, at least not on the foam core, so I decided to go with Americana Burnt Sienna. I then hand painted the brick sections using that paint. The difference in scale between the first version and the second version really started to show up here during the painting process, as I needed to do a lot more touch-ups this time around. Even though the burnt sienna paint was a relatively close match on the foam core, when I finished the building, I thought it was much too tan on the structure when compared to the other sections of the building. Now, I'm okay with having some differences in brick color, considering that the prototype structure was built in different phases, and you can see here in the prototype photos that the brick colors aren't exact matches. But I also thought that my paint shades were too far off. I hoped that the addition of the mortar wash and the India ink black washes would make it a closer match, but even that didn't quite get me there. I then took another look at my paint rack and realized I did in fact have an unopened bottle of the Rio Grande Freight Car Red. But I also didn't want to repaint the whole thing because, well, to be honest, it was a fairly long and tedious process. So instead, I made a wash similar to the washes I made for the mortar, although this one was less diluted, and I went over the brick sections using that wash, which gave the entire structure a redder tone. Afterward, I didn't bother to reapply the mortar wash because I thought that it was still showing through pretty well, but I did apply another black ink wash to darken it a little more. Here's what the two towers look like side by side. It's a big difference, isn't it? When the paint dried, I removed the old tower from the layout, detached the legs, and then glued them to the new tower. When that's set, I placed the new version of the tower on the layout. You can see here that the color isn't an exact match, but is close to the color of the original sections, while being different enough that it would represent a later addition to the core structure with its slightly off-color brick. Finally, with all this taken care of, I placed the new piece in its final location and part 3 was complete. Wait, what? Right. As I took photos and footage, I realized that I'd forgotten to put the window glazing on the tower. So the last step was to use the same black painted transparency that I had used for the curtain wall section, as you can see here. Finally, with all this taken care of, I placed the new piece in its final location, and part 3 was complete. Am I good this time? At the end of the day, I'm much more satisfied with the reworked tower than I ever would have been with the original. As it turned out, Chuck took my request for a redesign graciously and was happy to work with me to get what I was looking for. Getting myself there mentally wasn't easy and it wasn't painless, but it was necessary. And now looking back, I'm glad I did it. Because sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront your mistakes and make the necessary changes. So if you're struggling with a mistake that's weighing on you, don't be afraid to just go and fix it. It might be scary, but it also could be the best decision you ever make. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this building does a pretty good job of replicating the massive structure that is a prominent feature in this section of Baltimore, while also filling a large space in the corner of my layout. With the tower complete, that pretty much wraps up the construction on the structure itself, and now we'll move on to the more scenic elements of the project, including the overpasses, scenery, and perhaps another unrelated structure that I'm considering putting here to bridge the gap between the street and Cambridge Iron and Metal that on the layout is right next to this area, but prototypically is quite a distance away. Ever had a similar dilemma? How'd you address it? And how did it work out for you? Tell me all about it in the comments below. That's also the place for questions and suggestions. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, including my new Facebook group. Links are in the description below. Looking ahead to part 4, we'll talk about overpasses, including this narrow one that goes over a small section, and this larger one that crosses a more recent realignment of Eastern Avenue, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, check out my videos on Cambridge Iron and Metal to learn how I decided to take what was an empty area and turn it into a useful industry. You can do that by clicking on the links to the left. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the train room.